the Witch King of Angmar, a name that carried dread across Middle-earth. He was not just a mere servant of Sauron, he was his deadliest champion, a figure of pure terror whose very presence could break the will of the bravest warriors. But before he became the shadow-wrapped spectre that haunted the battlefields of the Third Age, he was something else, a mortal king. His name was long forgotten, erased from history as if he had never existed. Yet, in life, he was mighty, ruling over men with power and ambition. And that ambition is what doomed him. He was given one of the 9 rings of power, forged by Sauron himself, and like the others who bore them, he fell. But he did not just fall into darkness, he was consumed by it. The ring granted him power, unnaturally extending his life, but it came at the cost of his very soul. Slowly he faded from the world of the living, his body turning into little more than a spectral shadow. His will was no longer his own. It belonged to Sauron, the Dark Lord of Mordor. And among all the ring-wraiths, it was he who became the greatest. For centuries, he waged war in his master's name. He crushed the northern kingdom of Arnor, leading an unstoppable force that burned cities to the ground. His enemies trembled at his name, and wherever he rode, fear followed. He did not just slay his foes, he broke them, shattered their resolve, turned them into whispers of terror that spread across the land. No man could face him without their heart faltering. But there was something else, something darker. He was not merely a powerful warrior or a commander of dark forces. He had become something far more sinister. His sorcery was unlike anything Middle-earth had seen. Spells that drained the life from his victims, a voice that could shatter the courage of even the bravest knights, a presence so cold it could make the air itself freeze. He was the embodiment of death. The Witch King was not merely a servant of Sauron, he was terror incarnate. And then came the prophecy, a whisper from an ancient age, spoken as if the world itself had decreed it. No man can kill me. It was a statement of invulnerability, a declaration of doom to all who would dare stand against him. Time and again, warriors tried to challenge him, believing their swords, their courage, their numbers could make a difference. They were wrong. The prophecy held true. No man could end him, and he used that fear to his advantage. When he marched to war, it was not just armies he commanded, it was inevitability. He was doom given form, a force that could not be stopped. It was this power, this certainty, that made him the deadliest of Sauron's servants. But there was one force that believed it could stand against him, one being who had faced the darkest of evils and survived. Gandalf. Gandalf the Grey had once been a wanderer, a traveler across Middle-earth who whispered words of guidance to kings and adventurers alike. But that was before his fall into darkness, before his battle with the Balrog of Moria, before he was reforged into something greater. When he returned, he was not the same. He was Gandalf the White, a being of raw power, sent back by the very forces of the cosmos to finish his mission. With Saruman fallen and turned to treachery, Gandalf was now the true leader of the Istari, the order of wizards sent to Middle-earth to stand against Sauron. He had been granted greater strength, a clearer mind, and a purpose that burned within him like never before. He no longer carried doubt. He no longer hesitated. He was a warrior now, a beacon of light against the darkness. He had faced Sauron's might before. He had battled demons of flame, resisted the corruption of dark lords, and defied the will of powers greater than men could comprehend. But he had never faced the Witch King, not truly. And in his mind, there was no question. He was ready. There was no doubt that he could stop him. He had seen Sauron's forces, understood their weaknesses, and knew how to fight them. He was wrong. Gandalf believed in his power, but he had not yet witnessed what the Witch King had become. He thought he knew what it meant to stand against the Nazgul, but the Witch King was something else. A terror that had grown beyond what even the wisest minds of Middle-earth had predicted. Gandalf had battled many foes, but he had never before faced an enemy who carried the certainty of prophecy itself. And soon, on the broken walls of Minas Tirith, he would understand just how wrong he had been. Minas Tirith, the White City, stood tall and defiant against the coming storm, its mighty walls gleaming in the last light of the sun. But as the day faded and darkness crept over the land, hope dimmed with it. The sky turned an unnatural black, thick with shadow and malice, a smothering presence that seemed to choke the very air. Then came the drums, the deep and rhythmic pounding that signaled the arrival of Sauron's war machine. The fields of Pelennor were swallowed by an endless horde. Orcs, trolls, and monstrous beasts surged forward, their armor gleaming like the fangs of a hungry predator. But at the head of this army rode something far worse. The Witch King of Angmar did not need to shout commands, nor did he need to rally his forces. His very presence drove them forward, an unspoken promise of ruin. The defenders on the walls of Minas Tirith felt it before they saw him. A wave of dread, an unnatural fear that clutched their hearts with icy fingers. When he finally appeared, he did so as a king of nightmares. He rode upon a great winged beast, a creature of darkness and death, its long serpentine neck twisting as its piercing shriek split the night. The gates of Minas Tirith loomed before him, great, towering, seemingly impenetrable. But he did not hesitate. He had come for destruction. He had come for dominion. The city's first defense was fire. Arrows and flaming missiles rained from the ramparts, but the Witch King did not flinch. The siege towers rolled forward, and massive trolls dragged battering rams to the gates. And then came the great weapon, the ram forged in the deepest pits of Mordor, a monstrous device named Grond after the hammer of Morgoth himself. With each impact of Grond against the gates, a terrible sound rang through the city, shaking its very foundation. The defenders watched in horror as the gate, crafted to withstand the greatest of assaults, began to crack. With every strike, the power of the Witch King himself seemed to seep into the weapon, strengthening it beyond mere steel and wood. Then he raised his arms, and with a voice like the breaking of stone, he uttered words in the black speech. There was a deafening boom, not just of sound, but of dark sorcery. The gates of Minas Tirith, the pride of Gondor, shattered like glass. A gaping wound stood in their place, revealing the burning city beyond. Silence followed. For a moment, the defenders did not breathe, and then, through the wreckage, he rode forward. The Witch King entered Minas Tirith. There was no rush, no need for urgency. The city would fall. He already knew it. The soldiers trembled at his approach, backing away as he passed. He did not need to lift his sword. The air around him suffocated their will to fight. Fear was his weapon, and he wielded it to perfection. And then he saw him. Standing at the foot of the White Tower, robed in white, staff in hand, waiting. Gandalf. The two locked eyes across the ruins. There was no need for words. There was only one thing left, the duel that had been waiting for this moment. Gandalf did not move as the Witch King rode toward him. The air was thick with power, the very stones of the city seeming to groan under the weight of what was about to happen. This was not a mere contest of weapons. This was a clash of wills, a battle between two ancient forces. The King of Angmar and the White Wizard. The beast upon which the Witch King rode snapped its jaws, hissing in anticipation. But Gandalf stood firm. He raised his staff, and light shimmered around him, pushing back the shadows. It was a moment of defiance, a stand against the inevitable. The Witch King laughed. It was not a sound of amusement, it was a sound of knowing. He had heard tales of Gandalf the White. He knew this wizard had bested a Balrog, had returned from the dead, had been sent back with renewed strength. But he also knew something Gandalf did not. The power of the Nazgul had grown. Sauron's will was stronger than ever, and through that will, the Witch King had become something more. The air around him shimmered with dark sorcery, his form no longer just a shadow, but something deeper, something ancient and foul. The blade in his hand burned with an eerie light, a cursed weapon that could break even the strongest of warriors. The ground trembled. And then, something happened that had never happened before. Gandalf felt it, a sensation he had not known since the first age of the world. Doubt. For all his wisdom, for all his power, he had underestimated the Witch King. This was not just another foe. This was not just a powerful servant of Sauron. He was something far worse, a force of evil so pure that even Gandalf, a Maya, could feel the weight of its presence pressing against him. The staff in Gandalf's hand cracked, a thin fracture, small but undeniable, running along its length. His grip tightened. He was Gandalf the White. He had stood against Sauron's forces before. He had fought darkness in all its forms. But in that moment, for the first time since his rebirth, he felt something else. Shock. The Witch King advanced, his voice carrying a promise of destruction. "You cannot stop me. This is my hour." The words carried power, a weight that settled into Gandalf's very bones. For the first time he wondered, had he made a mistake? Had he miscalculated? Could he actually lose? The air between them crackled with magic, the tension unbearable. But then, a sound. A horn, deep and thundering, echoed across the fields. A sound of hope, a sound of war. The Witch King stopped. He turned, his head shifting toward the source of the noise. The riders of Rohan had arrived. The battle for Minas Tirith was about to change. And just like that, the Witch King was gone, vanishing into the chaos. Gandalf stood frozen in place, his heart still pounding. He had been ready to fight, ready to defend the city with every ounce of his power. But for the first time in his long existence, he realized something terrifying. He did not know if he would have won. Gandalf had faced countless foes in his long life. He had stood against dragons, fought against the corruption of kings, and even confronted a Balrog in the abyss of Moria. But something about his encounter with the Witch King unsettled him in a way he could not fully explain. It was not fear, not in the way mortals feared for their lives, but something else. A realization that for all his strength, for all his wisdom, he had come face to face with something that truly threatened him. Could the Witch King have defeated him? The thought lingered, unwelcome and persistent. Gandalf had always known that the Nazgul were dangerous, but this was different. This was power beyond what he had prepared for. The breaking of his staff had not been a mere trick of sorcery. It was a sign that, had the battle continued, he may not have stood victorious. He was not just facing a mortal warrior. The Witch King was not even fully a creature of this world anymore. He had transcended it, existing in both the physical realm and the spectral void where the Nazgul walked unseen. His very presence was a tear in reality, a disturbance in the natural order. And unlike Sauron, who relied on his distant malice and grand schemes, the Witch King was a weapon of pure destruction. It was not a question of skill. Gandalf was a Maya, a being who had existed before the shaping of the world. His magic was ancient, his knowledge deep, his experience beyond comprehension. But there were rules, boundaries. The wizards of Middle-earth were sent not as conquerors, but as guides. Their power, though immense, was restrained by a higher purpose, and therein lay the danger. The Witch King had no such restraints. There was no limit to the terror he could unleash. His strength came from Sauron himself, a direct conduit to the will of the Dark Lord. When he struck with the force of Mordor behind him. The weight of all the suffering and fear Sauron had crafted over the ages was funneled into this single being. And then there was the prophecy, the accursed words that had echoed across the centuries. No man can kill me. Did that include Gandalf? It was a question that should not have mattered, and yet it did. Magic was a force bound by rules, ancient decrees that even the greatest beings of Middle-earth could not ignore. If the prophecy held true, then no matter how powerful Gandalf was, he would not have been the one to end the Witch King. But would the Witch King have been able to destroy him? Gandalf did not have the answer, and that was what disturbed him most of all. The battle had not happened. The confrontation had been cut short by the horns of Rohan. But what if it had continued? Would Minas Tirith have been left without its protector? Would Gandalf have been struck down in the very city he had fought to save? As the Rohirrim charged into battle, sweeping across the fields in a storm of fury and steel, the Witch King turned away from Gandalf, drawn to a new threat. And in that moment, Gandalf remained still, gripping his staff, now whole once more, restored by his will, but the memory of its breaking still fresh in his mind. The battle raged on, the cries of men and orcs filling the air, but Gandalf stood in silence. A silence filled with unspoken questions. He had believed he was ready. That belief had been shattered. Had the Witch King truly been beyond his power? Or was it something deeper? A dark whisper, barely heard, lingering at the edges of his mind. A thought he dared not entertain. Had he, even for a moment, doubted himself? The Witch King did not hesitate when he saw the riders of Rohan storm onto the battlefield. He had known they would come. He had counted on it. Their arrival did not trouble him. It enraged him. How many times had men defied him, standing in foolish defiance against a doom that had already been written? He had crushed kingdoms before, burned cities to cinders, and slaughtered kings like cattle. This would be no different. He turned from Gandalf, his unfinished duel forgotten in the tide of war. He had no need to destroy the wizard now. The city was already breaking. Fear had taken root in the hearts of its people, and despair would finish the job. Let Gandalf watch as the world crumbled beneath his feet. Let him see the folly of his defiance. With a piercing shriek, his mount beat its leathery wings and soared toward the Rohirrim. The battlefield trembled beneath the charge of the riders. Thousands of hooves thundered against the earth, and the air rang with their battle cries. But the Witch King did not flinch. He was the master of this war, the unbreakable will of Sauron made flesh. He would show them what true despair looked like. And then, in the chaos of battle, his fate was sealed. Theoden, king of Rohan, stood against him. The old king led his riders with fearless resolve, rallying his people even as the darkness closed in around them. The Witch King had seen kings before. He had killed kings before. This one would be no different. He descended like a storm. His fell beast struck with monstrous fury, smashing Theoden's horse and sending the king crashing to the ground. The charge of the Rohirrim faltered, and for a moment, victory seemed assured. The Witch King dismounted, his dark presence swallowing all light around him. Then a single figure stepped between him and his prize. A woman. She stood over Theoden's broken body, her golden hair blowing in the wind, her blade held firm. The Witch King did not laugh. He did not mock. He did not need to. She was nothing, just another foolish warrior throwing her life away. His voice rang out, dripping with malice, declaring what he had always known to be true. "You fool, no man can kill me." She did not waver. She did not run. And then she removed her helmet. The battlefield seemed to stop. The howls of orcs, the clash of steel, the thunder of hooves, all of it faded into silence. A woman. "I am no man." The Witch King hesitated, not in fear, but in something far worse. A realization, a crack in the foundation of a prophecy that had once made him invincible. And in that moment, it happened. Meriadoc Brandybuck, a halfling, a creature beneath his notice, struck first. His enchanted blade, forged with ancient magic, cut through the unseen bonds that tied the Witch King to the world of the living. Pain, real, searing pain, coursed through the wraith's form. His will faltered. And then Éowyn struck. Her sword drove into the darkness where his head should have been. A scream tore through the battlefield, not just a cry of agony, but something deeper, a sound that should not have been possible. The Witch King of Angmar, Lord of the Nazgul, fell. His form collapsed inward, his essence unraveling, his very being swallowed by the void from which he had come. The armor he had worn, the symbol of his terror, crumbled to the ground, empty. The prophecy had been broken. But elsewhere, far from the battlefield, another battle was taking place. Gandalf had watched it all unfold. He had known the Witch King's end would come, but to witness it, to see with his own eyes that the most feared servant of Sauron had been destroyed, was something else entirely. And yet, something still troubled him. The question that had lingered in his mind since the moment his staff had cracked. Would he have won? He would never know. There would be no rematch, no second duel, no opportunity to test his strength against the Witch King. The battle had been taken from him, resolved by the hands of those who had not been bound by prophecy's curse. Éowyn and Merry had succeeded where the mightiest of warriors had failed. Gandalf did not feel bitterness. He did not feel anger. But what he did feel was something more unsettling. Relief. He had faced the Witch King and had seen what he was capable of. He had felt the weight of that power pressing down upon him, the malice that had threatened to crush even his unshakable will. And though he would never admit it, not to Aragorn, not to the surviving warriors of Minas Tirith, not even to himself, some part of him was glad. Glad that he had never had to find out what might have happened. The Battle of Minas Tirith was over, but the war was not won. Sauron still lived. His armies still marched. But one thing had changed. The greatest weapon of Mordor was gone. And yet Gandalf knew better than anyone. Sauron did not put his faith in just one weapon. The Dark Lord's will had not been broken. His gaze was already turning elsewhere. The Witch King was defeated. But the real war had only just begun.